All right, so as you guys saw from the intro, today we're taking a look at this. This is the FLUX R365 chassis. This is the pistol version. They do make a short stock and a long stock version as well, but this is the pistol version that I have here. So Flux Defense has been making chassis for the 320 series of pistols for quite a few years now. And about 3-ish years ago, they announced that they were working on a 365 version. And from a concept standpoint, as somebody who had a 365 just laying around not doing much, I couldn't wait to get my hands on one of these, and I was lucky enough to actually do so. So when they did the drop, I think they only released about 450 units. So small companies, small batch drop, that's just a nightmare for trying to actually get a website to work and get a product purchased. And luckily here I am. I didn't purchase it through Flux because the website crashed, cart wasn't reserved like they said it was going to be. Luckily, somebody in the whole debacle accidentally purchased 2 of them, and that's how I got this one. So I got pretty lucky to get mine and actually have had it. That being said, with the 450 of them, I don't know how many of them are the braced versions, how many of them were the stocked versions, or really how many of them are actually being used, because I don't know if people wanted to go through the paperwork to do the form if they had a stocked version, or if they're just waiting to try to get a brace arm to go on that, but they have a chassis. So that's kind of part of this. Is the sample size for these is very small, less than 450 units. I would probably venture to be less than 400 or less than 300 of these out there actually being used in the wild. And so with that, there's not a whole lot of information on them, and that's what I wanted to do this video on. I've had this since pretty much the initial drop, put about 2,000 rounds through it now, and I have some real design questions on this, about some of the features, the choices they made when they were designing this. And so that's what we're going to kind of go over today. So we're going to take this over to the tabletop, and I'm going to go through all that stuff with you guys right now. All right, so we've got this on the table now. I'm going to show you a picture, and this is the best way that I can explain this. I love the concept. I love the idea, but this is what I feel like I got in product execution. And I'm going to explain this and why I feel like this is what I got. So let's take a look at it. First thing we're going to look at is the holster. It's really not a holster. It's a sheath. It is QLS on this side, and it does come with inside the waistband in a claw, so you can appendix carry it. Is it possible? Yes. Is it something you're going to do every single day? Probably not, but is it possible? Yes. Here's the problem I have with the holster. It's not a holster. It's a sheath. It has zero retention in it whatsoever. It sounds like it locks up, but it doesn't. It's a early 2000s Phobos quality holster. It's horrible at best. So coming from front back, first thing we're going to look at here is we're going to look at the shroud. I understand the point of the shroud, right? It's to make sure that if people C-grip this gun, they don't shoot their finger off if they're running something less than a 6-inch barrel. I really like that concept. I run it even though I'm running a 6-inch barrel because I like the aesthetic look of it. The problem I have with it is in order to take my slide off, because my optic runs into my shroud, I either have to take my optic off or I take my shroud off, which would be the easy thing to do. But in order to take the shroud off, you have to take your light off because there's 2 screws that go through the bottom of the pick rail here into the shroud. And so I'm not sure why they decided to attach it through the bottom of the pick rail when you can see there's some, various accessory holes that they have here where they're going to have some sort of wrap over the top optics mount, I'm assuming. If they're going to have something that wraps over the top, why not just extend this mounting method all the way down or as far down as possible and put the shroud on that way? It seems a little awkward that I got to take my light off, take my shroud off, to take my slide off. Kind of really weird to me. The other thing, it's just a quirk of mine, not really a design flaw. I kind of understand why they did it, but it's a quirk. When you run a light on, you lose about 1 inch of the grip on this forward magwell. I have small hands, so even when I grip this, my finger hangs off the bottom down here. And I get that if you're running a 17-inch mag or a 17-round mag or a 21-round mag, that it's not going to be an issue. But if you're concealing this, you're probably not going to want to run a full mag up here. So I printed this little 3D finger well thing just to kind of give my pinky a little spot to go when I shoot this. It's the way it is. There's really not a whole lot you could do. I guess you could extend that 3/4 of an inch, but it makes the overall profile a little bigger, but it's not going to be any bigger than this. But the other thing, the light, it was obviously designed for the TLR 7 sub light. And so you can see here where the trigger guard of the pistol would normally be. So the light would sit a little further back. But because the chassis of this is wider, the light can't sit as far back. And that makes it a little difficult to get to your switches because the light body and the chassis body are pretty much the same white body. The light body is just a little bit wider. I kind of got to take my finger and kind of pull forward to get my light to engage. With that, though, you can't run the emissary development paddle shifters because the switches are a little longer and they push up against the chassis. You have to put your light forward, but then it doesn't clear the brace. So it's really specifically designed for this particular setup here. So moving back, this is the biggest design flaw of the entire thing, and that is the stock or the brace release here, the button. When you get this from Flux, it comes with a little spring in here, and that spring essentially pushes this button rearwards at all times so that when you close it, it automatically locks. And when you have it automatically locking, you only have it in a manual deploy mode, meaning in order to deploy this, I have to push forward with my finger to deploy the brace or the stock. What if I want it to deploy when it comes out of the holster? Flux is going to tell you you have to take the button off. Just take the button off, take the spring off, take everything off. It's manual deploy. While that works, yes, it defeats the purpose. The purpose of this should have been, I want to choose whether I want it to be manual deploy or automatic deploy. And that could have simply been done by making this button on a detent system. So it was a rearward detent position and a forward detent position. And that would allow me to determine how I want this to deploy. So right now, it would be in manual. So I push the button forward, it deploys. Now, if I want this to be automatic, say I want it to come out of the holster and draw, I would simply make sure that button is in the forward position, put it in the holster. Now when I remove the holster, it deploys. I did this by simply removing the spring, reassembling the button. But when I did, I put a bunch of like moldable plastic inside of the groove where the spring went. And now my button requires some force to move. So essentially is a detent button, but without just such a positive detent. So if I wanted to be manual, then I know when I close this, push the button rearward. Now it's manual deploy. If I push that button forward, it's going to be automatic deploy. I can have it like this. It's a nightstand gun. It stays like this. When it goes in the holster, I simply push that forward and it's automatic deploying. The biggest design flaw and oversight of the whole thing, and I don't know how it got through product development like this. This will be changed on version 2. I will pretty much guarantee it. I don't know anybody over there, but I know that's a big design flaw, and they've probably figured that out by now. Second biggest issue I have with this is the little red spring. This is glued into the chassis with no mechanical connection. So somewhere between 200 and 500 rounds, you're going to probably lose that spring. I lost mine at like 380, and then again at like 670 or somewhere in there, just over 650 essentially. It fell out twice. Since then, it has stayed in there, but it should be mechanically attached to the chassis somehow. Some way, some sort of screw, pin system, something, but you cannot rely on glue to hold that spring in. Kind of with that, you can see all the wear on the aluminum plunger here that interfaces with that spring to help it with its deployment. I probably would have made this a button head screw or a cap head screw, whatever they call it. I think it's a cap head screw. Threaded it in there so you have steel on the steel spring contact. But then even with that screw in there, you could thread that screw in or out depending on if you wanted more or less spring tension during the deployment. I just think it would have made a little bit more sense to me. So kind of give you an idea, the red spring essentially operates from closed to about 45 degrees. Then it relies on the momentum that it generated in that time to carry the brace all the way around and lock into position. You see on this side, there's a small piece of shock cord that's attached to the brace. And this is to help with pulling that momentum around and closing if it brushes up against your shirt, your arm during deployment, which tends to happen a little bit. You will bump into it. The problem I have with this is it doesn't always work. So if I were to take this from 40 or say 90 degrees from where it needs to be and I let it go, it's not going to lock into place. Now, this is a twofold problem. First part of that is when this is stored in a holster or folded, this shock cord is fully stretched to max potential all the time. So this shock cord wears out quickly. This is my second piece of shock cord I've put on this in whatever it's been since the drop. 4 or 5 months, 6 months, I don't know, 5 months. Second piece of shock cord, so now I'm going on my third piece. The other part of that is on the brace itself, you can see some wear that's happening right here. This is where this section of the brace interfaces with the locking mechanism, kind of push the locking mechanism up so that it drops down into this little channel that's right here. I don't know why this wasn't beveled a little smoother from the factory. Probably when I cut this and replace this shock cord, I'm going to file this down and make it smoother so that it don't have such a hang up right here. If that's a smoother transition to the lockup, it's going to require less force to get to that lockup. I don't like the shock cord. It just looks janky on a $1,000 chassis. You have a 60-cent piece of shock cord and a glued in red spring on a $1,000 piece of equipment. Those are three things really that just should not go together whatsoever. But that's my thoughts on the Gen 1. I'm going to call it that because I know they're coming out with another one at some point. FLUX Raider 365. All right, guys, there you have it. My thoughts on the FLUX Raider 365 chassis. Remember, guys, perspective shapes perception. And if you've made it this far in the video, you're probably looking for what most others overlook. If you want to see more, hit the like button, subscribe, and share your perspective in the comments down below.